Hey, when there's a problem, you call a man. The Democrats can't even tell you what a man is.
So when you hear Walz brag about how much of a man he is, what does that tell you?
I think there might be a little bit of a cope there, you could say. There's a little bit, he has to remind us how masculine he is, trying to not even be able to load a shotgun or...
Joe Rogan and Charlie Kirk didn't hold back when they went after Governor Tim Walz. What started as a political conversation quickly turned into a complete breakdown of Walz's leadership. They didn't yell or wave their arms. They didn't need to. They used facts, humor, and real-life logic to pull apart everything Walz has built his political image on. By the end, it wasn't just a roast, it was a full dismantling of a man who tried to govern with slogans instead of substance. They exposed him for what he really is, a politician more interested in applause than action. Joe Rogan started by questioning Walz's public image. Walz likes to present himself as a strong leader, a common-sense guy, someone who gets things done. But Joe saw through it. He said Walz acts like he's on a TV show instead of running a real estate. During the pandemic, while people were losing businesses and struggling to survive, Walz was giving speeches and making decisions that didn't make any sense. Gyms were shut down, but big retail stores stayed open. Restaurants were forced to close, but you could still shop in crowded malls. Joe pointed out the absurdity of those rules with the sharpness of someone who's tired of lies. He mocked the way Walz held on to his emergency powers like a toddler refusing to give up the remote control. There was no logic, just control. Then Joe turned to Walz's obsession with appearance. He said Walz is more focused on how things look than how they work. While businesses were dying and people were desperate for help, Walz was holding press conferences about equity and climate. Goals. Joe didn't say those issues weren't important, but he made it clear that leadership means knowing when to focus on survival. And during that crisis, Walz didn't lead, he hid. Joe compared it to watching a bad sci-fi movie where the captain of the ship is reading motivational posters while the engine is on fire. People needed help and all Walz gave them were buzzwords. Charlie Kirk joined in with the facts. He didn't try to be funny. He came in like a prosecutor, laying out one failure after another. He started with the economy. Under Walz, businesses in Minnesota were punished instead of supported. Small companies, the backbone of local communities, were ignored. While other states reopened and rebuilt, Minnesota stayed frozen. Walz seemed more interested in impressing activists than helping workers. Charlie said Walz governed like a man who thought businesses were the enemy, not the foundation of the economy. Taxes went up, regulations multiplied, and investors ran for the hills. Next, Charlie took aim at education. He brought out the numbers, falling test scores, growing bureaucracy, and schools that cared more about political ideology than teaching kids how to read and do math. Charlie said under Walz, schools became political labs instead of places of learning. When test scores dropped, Walz didn't focus on fixing the problem. Instead, he added more diversity officers and more training sessions about privilege. Charlie joked that the only thing multiplying in those classrooms was paperwork. Kids weren't learning, they were being used for someone else's agenda. Then came the crime issue. Charlie didn't just talk about rising crime, he painted the full picture. He explained how police morale crashed under Walz. Officers were demonized, departments were defunded, and the message was clear: criminals mattered more than victims. During the George Floyd riots, instead of stepping up, Walz stepped back. He waited. He hesitated. While cities burned, he stood behind a microphone and gave soft speeches about unity. Charlie said Walz governed like a substitute teacher with a guitar, someone who talks about peace but doesn't know how to keep order. The result: streets became unsafe, businesses got looted, and families were left wondering where their leaders had gone. Joe Rogan jumped back in with his trademark style, simple, clear, and brutally honest. He laughed at Walz's strange behavior, like his odd remarks about masculinity and tampons in boys' bathrooms. Joe joked that Walz seems like a guy who's trying too hard to please everyone online. He's more worried about trending on social media than fixing the roads, balancing the budget, or listening to real people. Joe called him out for being disconnected, saying Walz lives in a world of headlines and hashtags, not neighborhoods and households. He said governing isn't about being popular, it's about being responsible. Joe also brought up how Walz always seems to speak after the disaster happens. Something goes wrong, and then Walz shows up with a calm voice and a speech about how we all need to do better. But Joe wasn't buying it. He compared it to someone who breaks a window and then gives a talk about glass safety. Walz never takes real responsibility. It blames others, the federal government, the weather, even the timing of events. Joe said if Walz tripped on his shoelaces, he'd blame the shoe store. That kind of leadership doesn't solve problems, just creates confusion. Charlie continued the takedown by talking about the deeper issue: Walz's belief that government knows best. He said Walz treats every problem like a social experiment. More rules, more programs, more agencies, but never more results. Charlie explained that this type of thinking leads to bloated systems where nothing works, but everyone feels good for trying. He mocked the idea that creating a dozen committees is better than actually helping people. He said Walz governs like a man who just finished reading a fantasy book about a perfect world and thought he could build it by giving speeches. They both agreed that the real tragedy of Walz's leadership is how out of touch it is. Joe said, trying to govern Minnesota from a media playbook is like running a farm using Yelp reviews. From the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, the cows are missing, the fields are dead, and nobody knows who's in charge. Charlie added that Minnesota used to be known for smart policies and solid values. But under Walz, it became a quote. It became a testing ground for failed theories and forgotten promises. Joe and Charlie weren't just throwing insults, they were telling the truth in a way that anyone could understand. They didn't need to shout because the facts were loud enough. They laid out how Walz hurt the economy, damaged schools, weakened law enforcement, and ignored the real needs of the people. And they showed how his nice-sounding words were just a mask for failure. They also talked about how Walz handled personal image. Joe laughed at the idea that Walz presents himself as a regular guy, a coach, a fixer, someone you'd have a beer with, but when push comes to shove, Walz hides behind cameras and advisors. Joe said it's like watching a guy who claims he can fix trucks but can't even open the hood. Charlie called him the governor of press conferences, someone who smiles for the media but forgets to show up for the people. In the final part of their discussion, Joe and Charlie brought everything together. They said the problem with leaders like Walz isn't just bad policies, it's a mindset, a belief that style is more important than substance, that looking good matters more than doing good, that talking about problems is the same as solving them. But it's not. And under Walz, the people of Minnesota have paid the price. Joe ended the conversation by saying that real leadership is about facing the hard stuff. It's about showing up when things go wrong, making tough decisions, and not blaming others when it's your job to lead. And in all those ways, Walz failed. Charlie added that if Walz had spent less time writing press releases and more time listening to Minnesotans, the state might not be in such bad shape. But he didn't. And now, the results speak for themselves. What made their takedown so powerful was how real it felt. They didn't use complicated words. They didn't talk down to anyone. They just spoke clearly, directly, and honestly. They showed that Walz isn't the man he pretends to be. And once the curtain was pulled back, all that remained was the truth and the sound of a political illusion falling apart. Charlie Kirk didn't let up. After exposing Tim Walz's failures in crime, education, and business, he turned his focus to the governor's constant excuse-making. Charlie said Walz has mastered the art of avoiding blame. Every time something goes wrong in Minnesota, Walz finds someone else to blame. It's the federal government's fault. It's the weather. It's misinformation. It's bad timing. It's anything except his own decisions. Charlie joked that if Walls spilled his coffee, he'd call a press conference to blame gravity and demand a review of cup manufacturing regulations. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. In leadership, taking responsibility is not optionalized the foundation. But with Walls, responsibility is just a word for speeches, not something he practices. Joe Rogan agreed. He described Walls's speeches as a mix of motivational quotes and buzzwords, always delivered with a calm tone, as if sounding wise can cover up being wrong. Joe said listening to Walls is like watching someone try to explain a broken car by quoting a fortune cookie. He never talks about fixing the engine. He just says we all need to reflect and move forward. But people don't need reflection. They need working solutions. They need their schools to function, their neighborhoods to be safe, and their jobs to be protected. Joe's point was simple. Walls isn't leading, he's acting. He's playing a role instead of doing the job. Charlie brought up the dangerous side of that behavior. He said Walls treats politics like a play, but the consequences are real. When crime rises, people suffer. When schools fail, kids fall behind. When businesses close, families lose income. Charlie said it's one thing to make a mistake and admit it.